special city council meeting. Today is Thursday, May 19th. Welcome. Any person with a disability who requires accommodations to participate in this meeting should telephone the city clerk's office at 530-274-4390 at least 48 hours prior to the meeting to make a request for a disability-related modification or accommodation. City Council welcomes you to attend the meetings electronically or in person at the City Hall Council Chambers located at 125 East Main Street, Grass Valley. Regular meetings are scheduled at 7 p.m. on the second and fourth Tuesday of each month. This is a special one and it's at a different time. Your interest is encouraged and appreciated. This meeting is being broadcast live on Comcast Channel 18, not 17, by Nevada County Media, on the internet at cityofgrassvalley.com or on the City of Grass Valley YouTube channel. Members of the public are encouraged to submit public comments via voicemail at 530-274-4390 and email to public@cityofgrassvalley.com. Comments will be reviewed and distributed before the meeting if received by 5 p.m. Comments received after that will be addressed during the item and or at the end of the meeting. Council will have the option to modify their action on items based on comments received. Action may be taken on any agenda item. Agenda materials, staff reports, and background information related to regular agenda items are available on the city's website. Again, that is cityofgrassvalley.com. Materials related to an item on this agenda submitted to the council after distribution of the agenda packet will be made available on the City of Grass Valley website, subject to city staff's ability to post the documents before the meeting. Council chambers are wheelchair accessible and listening devices are available. Other special accommodations may be requested to the city clerk 72 hours in advance of the meeting. Again, that number is 530-274-4390. We are happy to accommodate. We are going to call this meeting to order. Please stand and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I
pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, Taylor, can you please call the roll?
Councilmember Brandstrom.
Present.
Councilmember Hodge.
Yes.
Councilmember Ivy.
Yep.
Vice Mayor Arbuckle.
Here.
Mayor Aguilar.
Here.
All 5 members are present.
Okay. Any changes to the agenda?
No changes from staff.
All right, I look for a motion to approve. the
So
agenda.
moved. Second.
We have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye. Aye.
Aye. All right, unanimous. We have public comment next. Members of the public are encouraged to submit public comments via voicemail at 530-274-4390, or you can email the city at public@cityofgrassvalley.com. Comments will be reviewed and distributed before the meeting if received by 5 p.m. Comments received after that will be addressed during the item and or at the end of the meeting. Council will have the option to modify their action on items based on comments received. Action may be taken on any agenda item. Are there any public comments, Taylor?
There are no public comments at this time.
And there is nobody here. Well, there's people here. Anybody want to do a public comment? All right, I'm going to close public comment then. All right, consent items. All matters listed under the consent calendar are to be considered routine by the City Council and or Grass Valley Redevelopment Agency and will be enacted by one motion in the form listed. There will be no separate discussion of these items unless before the City Council and or Grass Valley Redevelopment Agency votes on the motion to adopt. Members of the council and or agency staff or the public request specific items to be removed from the consent calendar for separate discussion and action, but council action is required to do so as a roll call vote. Unless the council removes an item from the consent calendar for separate discussion, public comments are invited as to the consent calendar as a whole and limited to 3 minutes per person. Is there any public comment on the consent?
There are no public comments on the consent.
Okay.
So moved.
We have a
Second.
motion to approve the consent and a second. Taylor, please call the roll.
Councilmember Brandstrom.
Yes.
Councilmember Hodge.
Yes.
Councilmember Ivy.
Yes.
Vice Mayor Arbuckle.
Yes.
Mayor Aguilar.
Yes to
Aye.
fireworks.
Yes, it is.
All right. Pending great weather and no
Yes.
wind, we will
No
have
wind.
fireworks for the 4th of July.
I thought we were talking about day night. but that's fine.
All right, now we have administrative item, which is why everybody's here tonight. Fiscal year 2022-23 preliminary budget overview. We have our finance director, Andy Heath. The floor is yours.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. For the record, Andy Heath, the city's finance director. First of all, thank you to the council for being available tonight for this special meeting. Much appreciated. What I'd like to do for you tonight is actually talk about the preliminary budget for the coming fiscal year, fiscal 22-23. It starts July 1st, just in a couple of months from now. The city's charter does require that a preliminary budget be adopted by the city council prior to a final budget being adopted in June. That preliminary budget must be adopted by May 31st. So every year you kind of get to hear two budgets. The goal of this preliminary budget is to build in as much as possible and have very few changes that come back, which is coming back to you on June 14th, a month from now, so that we can pretty much get everything out of the way now. So as a result of that, we've worked extensively with the department heads, making sure that what you're seeing tonight is probably very close to, if not exactly, what you're going to see on June 14th. So the goals for tonight will be to approve the 22-23 preliminary budget and then provide any further direction that your council might have to staff regarding the final budget as we prepare that over the course of the next couple of weeks. And then to set June 14th, 2022 as the date for the public hearing for the 22-23 final budget. And I think we'll discuss tonight. We'll give you an overview of the budget development process and some of the assumptions that have been used to prepare the budgets for the major funds, which is what we'll focus on tonight, which will include the general fund and the major E fund, which are the two largest discretionary funds that the city has, where the council has the most discretionary ability to pretty much do whatever the council's will is with those funds that are received there. We'll go over the two enterprise funds, just the water fund and the sewer fund, give you a capital projects fund update. And then there's a couple of other special revenue funds I want to talk about as well, just because there's some significant activity that's going on in those funds. And then we'll close up with the 22-23 final budget development and any comments you might have. So development of this budget and some of the related assumptions that have been built into the activity for the coming fiscal year was to first of all look at what has happened already this fiscal year. We just brought the mid-year back to you a couple of months ago, where we actually went through all of the fiscal 21-22 activity. As part of that fiscal activity that you saw that COVID really didn't impact the city as much as we thought it would, particularly for the year finished June 30th, 2021, the most recently audited year. Where we had a very large surplus in the general fund because COVID didn't impact us and we really watched what we were spending. So as a result of that, you had a large surplus in the general fund. So we looked at 21-22 again in developing this budget and found that we're able to project some pretty healthy numbers in the coming year, even though there's some economic issues out there that we'll discuss as well. We work closely with the department heads, as I mentioned, to determine their financial needs to deliver the base. That is the ongoing requirements that are necessary to provide the services to the community. And then these supplemental requests, any additional requests, whether it be one-time or new program costs that the departments were going to be recommending as part of this process. We always use conservative budgeting practices for both revenues and expenditures. And as a result, we eliminate all the 21-22 one-time activity and then ask departments to resubmit that to the extent that they want to do that. Funding in this budget is provided for 105 FTE, which includes 3 part-time positions citywide. So all of those 108 positions are fully funded in this budget. Okay, so this budget assumes from an appropriation perspective, the spending perspective, that you're going to spend money all year from July 1st to June 30th of the following year for all 108 positions. Okay, so they're just budgeted the whole year. More than likely, you will have salary savings that accrues because you can't keep all those positions filled for the entirety of the year. So that's where you end up with some surpluses, and that's where you end up with extra funding, as the year progresses to do different things. But all those positions are funded with this budget. This year, there's additional set aside funding in the general fund towards the corporation yard. You may remember as part of the current year's budget, the 21-22 budget, we actually set aside $350,000 for the corporation yard, and that is appropriated in the general fund. That hasn't been spent yet. We're recommending that we appropriate an additional $400,000 in the coming year for that purpose to give us a total of $750,000. So that's a major project that's happening that the general fund is paying a major part of. And then we want to use prior surpluses, which would be the surplus from the previous year, which was just over $1 million, and you'll see that on the forecast, okay? Towards the Mill Street Pedestrian Plaza. You may recall that very recently, within the last month, your council approved a funding schematic for the Mill Street Pedestrian Plaza, which included $400,000 of money from the general fund. That $400,000 is coming from a prior year surplus. So when you see this year's budget, you're going to see a deficit of about $386,000, but that's because we're using that prior year surplus to offset that. And when I show you the forecast, you'll see where the numbers are just pretty much the same across all years. And then, of course, focus on sustainability in all funds. We want to make sure that we're using that forecast that we prepare as a tool to make sure we can continue to afford what we're doing on an ongoing basis today, well into the future. Some of the revenue impacts from COVID, just to point out a couple of major sources in the general fund. Sales tax, we're definitely back to pre-COVID levels. So, we're forecasting that sales tax will be far and above what we've ever collected before in the general fund. And that's due to just the robust economy right now, and then the Wayfair impacts associated with the online sales that accrue to the city. So just over $8 million is budgeted for sales tax. Transient occupancy tax, definitely back to pre-COVID levels. We're looking at having this fiscal year a record year for collections of TOT. So it'll be the highest year that the city's had. Next year, we're projecting $913,500. Property taxes, which is all types of property taxes, whether it's the BLF in lieu, the main secured property tax, supplemental property tax, and then the property tax that we receive as part of the redevelopment money that's no longer needed by the city for those activities. We assumed a 3% growth. So this probably is conservative, given where the housing market has come and what the assessor is likely to do for the coming year. So once we get to the beginning of the fiscal year, probably August timeframe, we'll know what that number is, and we'll be able to come back and some of the revenue sources in other funds. In the Major E fund, again, there is a sales tax that's collected, the 1% transactions tax for Major E, and we are back to pre-COVID levels, looking at having the highest year ever for Major E this year and next year, about 6.9 million. Gas tax fund, also demand for gas is still high. People in California are paying between $6 and $7 a gallon, and they're still buying gas. So as a result of that, the projections for fuel remain high, and we have about $733,000 in the tax and the road maintenance rehabilitation act money, the SB1 money that does come to the city every year as well. When we look at the core general fund, what I've done here is the top line where it says FY 21-22 updated budget. That number is might be different from mid-year, which you saw, but it's just updated for what I truly anticipate to happen by the end of the year. So just over 16 million in revenue will be offset by just under 15.6 million in expenditures, and we'll have a surplus of just over $400,000, 429,000. That surplus is what's being used for the Mill Street project. Okay, so that's going to carry over into next year and actually be reserved specifically for that project. Okay. For 22-23, the preliminary budget has just about 60,000 more in revenue, and that's because of the elimination of some one-time things and then the growth on top of that from the previous year. 16.08 million, offset by 16.46 million in expenditures. So you can see expenditures for next year are more than the revenues by about $386,000. That is only because we have the set aside for the courtyard, that new funding put in there. And when I show you the forecast chart, you'll see where that money is coming from and how that plays out. So That includes the $386,000 use of fund balance. That's assumed that we use the full contingency, which we never really do. So we have a $250,000 contingency built into the general fund that is a just in case thing, so that we don't have to dip into reserves if we need funding for something. That assumes that that's spent. The set aside for the courtyard is in there for 400. We also have direct capital from the general fund of $135,000 for storm drain, playground maintenance, and a fuel station project. What I have not added in to the budget yet is the impacts of any cannabis businesses that may open during the next fiscal year. And then the sales tax impacts related to the new target. So we're continuing to work with our sales tax consultant, HDL, who, by the way, may be coming to the council in a future meeting through Zoom or maybe even live, just to kind of give the council an update on all things sales tax and kind of trends he's seen and such. So we're working on that and getting that scheduled. But the sales tax impacts of the new target are not added in either. So once we find out what those are, we'll put those back in. Some of the other general fund preliminary budget, some of the noted changes. We talked about the capital projects, Corporation Yard. We have full funding now for $750,000 that will be built into the general fund. We have the continued inclusion of the contracted services that we're doing with Nevada City Fire. So that is built in, and that's about $900,000 in revenue that comes in from them. The inclusion of anticipated labor and benefits costs is built into the budget. We anticipated that labor will settle sometime before July 1st, that all groups that we're negotiating with will settle. All those costs have been built into the budget. Inclusion of funding towards multimedia advertising and some consultants. There's $100,000 in the general fund for that. We have inclusion of funding for a license plate reader software and RIPA costs in the police department, about $50,000 for that. And then again, we do have the $250,000 appropriation for the contingency to the extent anything happens. All of this will continue to be updated as the year progresses, and we will update the model accordingly as well. PERS costs. So PERS costs have, at least for now, stabilized. And you can see that in this chart, the PERS chart, the fiscal 22-23, which is the bar right in the middle, the fifth bar there, is pretty much the same as what it was in 21-22. And that's because we're now experiencing our full year of having the bond in place. That yellow portion of the bar represents the cost that we're paying for the pension obligation bond that was issued and approved by the council and ultimately sold. And you can see that pretty much doesn't change for any of the years. That's because it's a fixed cost bond. We took that liability that fluctuated, kept getting bigger and bigger, and we fixed it. And we were paying a straight less than 3% interest on that now, and that's a good thing. The blue bar, the blue portion of the bar represents the normal costs, and this is what we pay for employees that currently work for the city. So you can see in 22-23, that blue bar gets a little bit higher than 21-22, and that's only because we built in the increases that I mentioned for labor. So the higher the salary, the more percentage that you pay for the blue bar. I also have left in an anticipated cost for future UAL, knowing that CalPERS is simply not likely to make 6.8%, which is their new discount rate year after year after year. This year likely being one of them, where we just looked today with the city manager at CalPERS returns for the first 6 months of the fiscal year through December were, I think, 4.5 or 4.8%. And, you know, they're banking on making 6.8%. But when you look at what the market's done since January 1st to today, and you just look at a standard index, the S&P 500 index, keeping in mind that CalPERS investment portfolio is 50% invested in public equity. Things in the Standard & Poor's index, okay? The Standard & Poor's index has decreased 19% since January 1st to today. So that's going to play havoc into that 4.8% that they've already earned for the first 6 months. And I can't wait to see what the January or the March 31st, the third quarter report says. I was hoping it would be available today, but it's not. But but it's going to be real interesting to see what happens. That being said, that's why I keep a portion of that orange bar in there. I just don't think it's going to go away. And I'd rather be on the safe side and recommend that we continue to at least appropriate a UAL cost to the extent one transpires and make future decisions based on the fact that you may have a UAL cost in the future.
So they were 4% up as of Q2 fiscal year.
I'm
or
sorry?
With their CalPERS was 4 and change percent up as of what date?
For the first 6 months of the fiscal year, as of December
Right, right.
31st. Yeah.
Right.
So they had made 4.8% on their portfolio,
Right.
which decent. Okay, I expect them to make 6.8% for the whole year. But when you look at what that index has done in the last, 5.5 months or whatever, 4.5 months, losing 19% is not gonna be good.
Right.
Yeah, for the public equity. And public equity makes up 50% of their entire $500 billion portfolio. Okay, so $250 billion of all their investments, everybody's retirement money is in public equity. So this is your forecast for the general fund. So you can see here, this kind of goes back to fiscal 18-19, a couple of years ago, where we made $489,000, and we put back $489,000 into the general fund. And then in 1920, we spent $938,000 of general fund reserves. And that was because, and actually 17-18, we had another $500,000 that we made. And we spent all of that in 1920 because we did things like, we did a lot of one-time things. We added the Tyler system, the financial system that we have. We had a lot of other capital related projects and the such. So that's what that was for. But then you can see in fiscal 2021, the year just finished 10 months ago or so, we put $1.5 million back into the general fund. And that is that COVID impact. That's the COVID not happening the way we thought it was going to happen on our finances. So we actually put that back. This year, we're putting back $429,000. And the next year, you see we have a deficit built in, and that is because we're using a portion of the $429,000 for the Mill Street or the corporation yard there. So that's just taking money from one year and moving it to the next. And I'll show you what total reserves are on the next slide. But you can see from a sustainability perspective, keeping in mind that for fiscal 22-23, all those raises are built in and assumed to happen. The future fiscal years 23-24 and beyond don't assume any labor increases though. Okay, so we don't like to get ahead of the council and assuming that anything's going to be approved. So those don't include anything. But you still have surpluses that appear to be sustainable in that they grow. Okay, so the conservative growth factors outweigh the conservative expenditure factors that are built in on the assumption side of the forecast. So still a good model. These are your reserves in the general fund. So your recommended reserve levels, assuming we do everything that we're saying we're going to do in next year's budget, bring all the revenue in and spend all the money that's in there for the general fund. We will have about $9.3 million in reserves in the general fund on June 30th, 2023. Of that $9.3 million, just under $6.5 million is reserved in assigned reserves that your council has set over the last few years. Those assigned reserves include things like your pension stabilization reserve. So in addition to having a portion appropriated in your costs, okay, for that UAL, you also have a reserve of $1.5 million set aside in case something really bad happens with the pension system. Similarly with OPEB, which is the health benefits that are paid after retirement, $500,000 reserve there. You have a capital and deferred maintenance reserve of $1 million and an economic contingency reserve, which pretty much captures everything economic that may come up. If you have a recession, you've got $2.5 million specifically set aside for that, where if we did have a recession, you would be able to use that money to really mitigate the impacts to the community of any service reductions over time. So instead of having to cut people right away or cut services right away, knowing that we can no longer afford them, you can dip into that economic contingency reserve and use that to really mitigate the immediate need that you might have to reduce expenditures. Okay, so it's a pretty good thing. And then aside from all that, all those designated reserves, you also have just under $2.9 million in undesignated reserves, which represents 17.3% of all the expenditures in the general fund in and of itself. That 17% is key because the GFOA, the Government Finance Officers Association of America, actually recommends that you keep 2 months of expenditures on tap for all the other things that I just mentioned. Okay. And so you've already got those set aside and you still have 2 months of reserves set aside for in undesignated fashion. So that $2.8 million is available to you. Okay, moving on to Measure E. So you can see Measure E focusing on the preliminary budget, about 6.9 million in revenue, which is mostly sales tax and some interest, is offset by 10.4 million in expenditures. So a lot of expenditures appropriated for Measure E next year. One thing I will say is sometime between now and June 14th, we will be going to the Measure E committee with the final budget for them. Make sure they see it before it actually comes back to the council on June 14th. But if we spend all that, we'll still have about just under 1.5 million in fund balance in Measure E at the end of the day, when the fiscal year next year is done. We did increase sales tax by about $100,000, fully recovered from COVID-19, the impacts of that. Measure E does fund 21.2 positions in police and fire, just under $3 million worth of staff costs, and non-related personal costs for $364,000. The first year of the 10-year debt service that we did for the $6 million parks bonds, which are also appropriated in another fund this year, is being paid for out of Measure E, and will be $654,000. And I might say that, you know, that the interest rate on that bond, or that COP, certificate of participation, was 1.6%. And today the treasury yield on the 10-year bond is fluctuating between 2.8 and 3%. So we got a really good deal getting that money for 1.6%. That's some significant savings there. This also funds police and fire vehicles and leases. We have an engine in a utility vehicle being purchased in 22-23 for the fire department. So the engine was previously approved. It just takes so long to make these things and you don't pay for it really until you get it. So that money is appropriated in 22-23. And then we have $5 million appropriated towards street rehabilitation and overlay, a huge array of parks activities, Mill Street Pedestrian Plaza, Memorial Park Pool, Mill Street Parking Lot. And there's a whole list on the schedule for Measure E in the capital schedule for that fund. In the city's water fund, no real change in water rates. I will say that we are close to completing the rate study for both water and sewer. So that will be coming in short order back to the council. The water fund does project for the coming fiscal year $2.3 million in revenue, about the same as last year, 4.5 million in expenditures, and we'll have about $1.1 million in fund balance if we do all that. NID raw water costs, cost increases are built in. And then we have $2.4 million capital program for the treatment plant and water system maintenance, flushing program, water line projects. And then we have a new project for Linden and Church water line project. And then Memorial Park CDBG project, there's a portion of funding that's actually going towards that as well. When you look at the operating margins, so I like to point this out. So if you look at the core ongoing revenues that are received in the water fund, the rates and the interest, and you subtract the core ongoing expenditures for the staff and the operations of it, not capital, okay? And you take the difference, that's your margin, okay? So that's what the water fund is adding back every year to be able to afford capital in the event you don't have grants or other sources that may be available. So in the water fund, you have about $205,000 in operating margin. That is kind of low. And I will say, I'll be real curious to see exactly the way the water rate study comes out, especially in light of what might be needed from a capital perspective in the future. So that's a low operating margin.
And you just to clarify for the public, CDBG stands for Community Development Block Grant. Now we get into alphabet soup a little bit and I just,
And the city participates in that program at a very high level. So it's we do very well in that program.
wonderful.
Thank you. Okay, moving on to the sewer fund, the other enterprise fund. So again, no real change in revenue, no increase in the rates, 5.1 million in revenue, offset by just under 7.5 million in expenditures. The projected fund balance in that fund will be just over $5 million. And 4.7 of that is reserved, and it's reserved for a variety of things, including working capital, some debt service. It's also reserved for the pension bond. We have water and sewer reserves for that pension bond as well, because they have staff. Again, stable sewer service rates. Capital projects include just the annual maintenance that's done on the wastewater treatment plant, the Slate Creek lift station, which carries from year to year, and then the NPDES project. The operating margin in the sewer fund is also kind of low, $175,000. Okay, so again, it'd be real interesting to see where we're at in terms of actually looking at the rates and what they might be in the future. Capital projects fund, a lot going on in this fund. There's a lot of capital projects on tap. We have about $18.7 million in capital projects fund. This fund houses most non-enterprise fund projects that aren't directly paid for by either an enterprise fund or like the general fund or major E fund directly. So there's multiple funding sources, including grants and the such. We track those here because it's easier just to account for them. There's 3 new projects that are noted in the capital projects fund. Those projects include the Bennett Street Bridge, the fuel station installation, which I previously mentioned, and the Sierra College Field. I want to mention that ARPA funding is provided for the Mill Street pedestrian plaza. This funding is just over $3 million is provided for that project, but there's funding for that project nonetheless. And from a reporting perspective, what we're doing with the ARPA funding, because we're a recipient of less than $10 million, is we're actually recording that for public safety cost expenses so that we can simplify the reporting process. And then we're supplanting the money over into the Mill Street pedestrian plaza, which is completely legal. It's all good. And it just makes things easier from a reporting perspective. The deficit there, so you can see the fund balance is negative $35,000. I want to dig into this a little bit more, but I think this is a result of the anticipated local share associated with the recent storm costs that we had, and the difference between what's anticipated to be reimbursed by the state versus what we actually put out. I don't think we're going to get 100% of the money. So when we come back with final budget, I'll have the capital projects fund cleaned up and balanced out. Okay, special projects fund. This is kind of like a capital projects fund, but it has other sources of revenue. You can see that the special projects fund had about $6.5 million in revenue in the current fiscal year. That's for the bond money that we received, the COP money, the $6 million. And it's also for some payback of the RMTF funding that is owed, or several $1 million that's owed to the city from the Nevada County Transportation Commission back to the city. So we got a portion of that this year. And the $6 million in debt proceeds. We're not spending that much this year, very little expenditures, but you can see in 22-23, we now have $6 million in expenditures. Okay, so that $6 million represents expenditures of the bond proceeds to be used for the Sierra College Field and also the Condon Scott and turf replacement projects that are on tap. If we spend all that $6 million, we'll still have just over $1 million in this fund at the end of the day for other projects. Development impact fee. So these are your AB 1600 fees, which are fees that are received related to new development in the city. We are anticipating an expenditure budget of about $2.1 million for fiscal 22-23 to be used for appropriate nexus-based projects, including Mill Street pedestrian plaza, the storm drain plan, East Main Street improvements, Mill Street parking lot, and Matson Creek Phase 1. So all of those are appropriate for in the coming year as well. Okay. And we're also having a fee study done on our development fees to make sure that they are appropriate as well.
This basically implies that the fees are going up, right? Is that what I'm hearing? Is that what the nexus is gonna suggest? If that's what it's alluding to, the AB 1600 fees, if we're in approving this, we're basically saying that we need to raise those rates. Is that kind of?
Well, maybe not. So keep in mind that the spending $2.1 million is a large expenditure out of an AB 1600 funds. You collect these funds based on new development. Technically, you're supposed to use these funds within a defined period of time, okay? For things that are nexus based, and you have to have, it has to be within the realm of what you can spend them on. It can only be spent for specific things. So all of those projects down there have a nexus to one or more of the fees that are collected. Okay, so there's an array of fees. There's a storm drain fee, there's transportation fee, there's a fire fee, there's a police fee, there's all kinds of fees. But each one of those fees in and of itself can only be spent for certain things. You can't use one for another,
Right.
or just use it for anything. So we will still, even if we spend the 2.1 million, we'll still have 1.3 million left in the bank. And that assumes we only make interest, because all I budget for at the beginning of the year, which is that $50,000 in revenue, is the interest I think that we're going to earn on that fund. Because I can't predict when we're going to get new development fees. But you can see that for 21-22, we've received $179,000 so far year to date. That's an actual number. And that fluctuates with the amount of development. Sometimes it's higher. But we will continue to collect these. And then with the fee study that's being done, some of those fees may be adjusted upward or downward, depending on what the plan holds for the future and what we can identify as necessary based on improvements that might happen in the future.
Will you be bringing that fee study to us?
Yeah. I think, yeah.
Well, staff will be bringing you a fee study, yes, but
Could you
you
give us?
really
a
should
his-
look at that as something separate than the fee study we have today. Because that fee study will have its own nexus. And council will need to make decisions on what projects stay in and what projects go out. And depending upon the projects that are in and out will affect the fees. And do you still want to calculate certain fees? So I would look at this as the current system we have. We have to spend the money on the projects that are in the fee system that we have because we've been collecting those fees for that purpose. And we're now spending the fees for that purpose. As we do a new one, we will have an opportunity for council to reevaluate all of those options.
When we have that conversation later, I'll quit getting us off track here. Could you give us some history, like, to give us an idea of that fluctuating revenue a little bit, 5 years or 8 years?
Oh,
Is that
yeah,
easy?
definitely.
Is that
Yeah.
easy ask?
Yep.
Okay. Sorry to
No
interrupt.
problem. Okay.
And just to clarify for the public who may or may not be watching, the AB 1600 fees, they're non-fungible based on how they get divided. Is that correct? That if it's a fee for X, it cannot be paid to Y.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Very specific.
Thanks.
Okay, so that closes it out. So those were a couple of extra funds that I wanted to include. So with that, I'll be happy to answer any questions and then take any further direction your council might have as we prepare the final budget for consideration at a public hearing to be scheduled for June 14th, 2022.
Thank you, Andy. It was a great presentation. We'll start with Bob here.
Just kind of a big picture question. We just provided comments a couple meetings ago, beginning of May, I believe, on the strategic plan, which will be updated at some point. We're now looking at the budget. Before we look at the strategic plan, do you think that there's adequate flexibility in this budget to allow for new things or changes in our priorities based on the strategic plan?
I do. I actually thought about that today. And because I have the strategic plan up on my wall and I looked at it and go, okay, other cities are building in strategic plan information into their budget. We really don't know what ours looks like pursuant to council discussion until it's approved. But when we actually do approve that, we can go back and adjust the budget accordingly. One of the things that you have is an array of funding sources that can pay for a lot of different things, including some of the other funds, but having the general fund with the level of reserves that it has to do an array of things that come up to work them into an ongoing budget. And then having a Measure E fund, which pays for a lot of things that are in the strategic plan when it comes to the community-based stuff, is going to be good for that. So I don't see that there's going to be any issues.
Okay, and the other question is, you're budgeting for full staffing of, I think you said 105 full-time positions. What's our current staffing level at?
What's the current staffing right
What
now?
is current staffing at? Are we at 105 or are we at?
No, I want to say that there's a couple of firefighter vacancies. I think that there might be a couple of police vacancies, but there may be people in backgrounds for those vacancies. I know we have an engineer vacancy. There's a couple of public works vacancies. And I think that's about it.
So we could expect.
It's pretty close.
Funded, that that's where some of the slack might come from towards the end of the year, is you can never be fully staffed just because of turnover and stuff like that.
But from a conservative standpoint, on the expenditure side, I just like to budget it all. And because you never know, you may have a really good year where people really want to work here and you have all your positions filled.
Yeah, no, you need.
Say
it, but-
Grass Valley is a
Yeah.
great place to work. Right.
Okay, thank you.
You bet.
Thanks, Bob. Tom?
Yeah, it's an excellent presentation. Thank you very much. Yeah, I feel like it was 100%. I just kind of maybe would echo what Bob said. I think that's maybe a question for Tim that I don't know what to think, not having finished the strategic plan conversation and then seeing a number of things that should be committing to funding that I basically haven't heard much of, like the Bennett Street Bridge or the fuel station or the Sierra College Field. I'd heard some talk about that, but basically not much. So I just would like to.
Well, we could talk about those right now if you want. One, the Bennett Street Bridge is a grant. So it's not a huge impact to the general fund.
Cool.
It's a necessity. Caltrans rates our bridges and it needs a deck replacement. So that is a grant. The fueling station is also a grant from what did the first round ARS? Is
The PSPS.
PSPS funding. So that's an offset. That's actually going to go out to bid. So that's not using a general fund. That's a specific purpose that has been actually approved by council in the past, and we're just now finally getting forward to it. And what was the last project? Oh, the Sierra College Fields. That was actually brought up when we discussed the $6 million in bond funds to build fields.
Yeah, right.
It actually brought that project.
Right. I appreciate the answers here right now and in defining, right, the trees, right? And yeah, and I just, would just love to maybe just fill in these blanks in a little different order, right? So, so that I can focus on them a little differently so we can understand the budget, so we can understand our strategic goals and what we have to work with, right? There's nothing, I'm not gonna say any of those issues were bad or negative, and thank you for explaining that, but it's just maybe a matter of communication so that we can work together a little more thoroughly. And that's definitely not an indictment of any presentation here. So yeah, and it's just in all goodwill, I'm saying it out loud. Yeah, I'm not trying to be critical. So thank you.
Hillary?
I appreciate your thoroughness. This is always a difficult meeting because it's a lot of information. I think you present it in a really concise manner, and I appreciate it. So I'm looking forward to hearing the final, and I have no questions this time.
Jean?
And again, I say this every time, I so appreciate the fact that I understand what you're saying and I can read it ahead of time instead of having to ask a million questions during the presentation. So I really appreciate the fact that you took our strategic plan into consideration when you put this preliminary budget together. And I think you've done a great job. I think you've adequately addressed it and prepared us for some things that, we just don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what's going to happen with the gas tax. Gas keeps going up. Well, that means more gas tax for us, but does that mean that people are going to stop driving as much? nobody knows. That's an unknown, but yet that's just an example of an unknown, and you factor that in. So I appreciate it, and thank you so much for all your work. I appreciate it.
Yeah, people are not gonna be driving as much. Sometimes they will, but
Yeah.
with the target coming in, which is not included in this budget.
Sales tax.
Yeah, and sales tax revenues,
Yeah.
they're not gonna be driving far. They could go shop there.
Reduce-
They don't have to go to
reduce gas
Auburn.
tax.
Yeah.
They're not driving it.
Exactly. So we're really in a good
Sure, you're
financial position to prepare for what's to come. In the last few days, a lot has happened. A lot of uncertainty, the markets, interest rates, people are, stagflation is the new word. And there's people that have money that can spend it, some people that have lost a lot of money in the markets, but we have put ourselves here at the city in a very good financial position to prepare for stuff like this. So thank you, Andy, for your presentation on the budget. And I have no questions at this time. So thank you. Okay. So with that, we will open it up to public comment. Is there?
Mr. Mayor,
Yep.
you need a motion to approve the,
Oh, this is public comment.
oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Any public comment?
There are no public comments.
Okay, we'll open public comment here. No public comment here. Now we will look for a motion to approve this.
I'll make the motion to approve the fiscal year 2022-23 preliminary budget. Provide further direction to staff as it relates to the preparation of the fiscal year 2022-23 final budget. And set June 14th, 2022 as the date for the public hearing for the fiscal year 2022-23 final budget.
I will second.
We have a second. She squeaked it in. Taylor, can you please call the roll?
Councilmember Brandstrom,
Yes.
Councilmember Hodge,
Yes.
Councilmember Ivy,
Yes.
Vice Mayor Arbuckle,
Yes.
Mayor Aguilar,
Yes,
5 yeses.
thank you, Andy. Okay, now on to brief reports by council members. Tom,
Nothing to report.
right. Bob,
I'll pass. I'll save it for next week.
excellent. Hillary,
I'm looking forward to downtown in Grass Valley this weekend. I know I'm not the only one.
yes.
Oh, also, one of the best ways to support your local budget is to shop local.
Right.
So don't forget to do that. I did some of that recently and it was very fun. So go hang out on Mill Street and Main Street.
Yes. Thank you. Jan,
I'll save a lot of it for next Tuesday. I just want to say that Tim and I listened in to a roundtable with the deputy, whatever, I can't remember, deputy somebody from FEMA, talking about infrastructure, and
excuse me.
it was interesting. That's all I can say. It was interesting. I asked him if he wanted to listen in, because normally I do that at home. And I was glad to have Tim there because we had some questions and tried to get in stuff, but they really already had it all figured out. Hi, Tim.
Yes, they did, but it was still, we found out there's some common ground with us in Butte County, so.
Yes, we did. One of the supervisors from Butte County was on, and she went first, and she said all the stuff about rural communities and about Paradise and the length of time it takes to reimburse after that, because there's some people, she was saying, because that's her particular district in Butte County, that have still not been reimbursed for their home. And it's been 5 years now. 4 or 5 years. Yeah, so it was interesting, and I made a contact with her, and we will be in touch and see what we can do to speed them along. I doubt it. We can try. So all I can do is try. So, and the rest of it I'll save till next time.
Well, this Saturday, Armed Forces Day, Mill Street is going to have quite a show. We've got flyovers. parking might be a challenge. There are places that you can park remotely and shuttle in. So check out the GV Chamber website.
Right, it's a fairgrounds.
There's the fairgrounds, across the street from the fairgrounds,
and
probably the Root Center, maybe, no. You can park there and
You
take the
could park
regular
there and
bus.
walk.
Well, they
It's
have
a
the regular,
long walk.
they have the regular bus.
Well, you could take the regular bus,
Yeah,
yes.
so there's
yes.
other places to go and
Yes.
park and converse in. And, oh, I was just told, yeah, to vote.
Yeah.
Your Ballots are in there. Do
in
your
your
civic duty
mailboxes.
to vote. And hope, yeah, hope everybody has a very fun and safe weekend at Armed Forces Day. So
Okay,
hope to see you there. Meeting adjourned.
It'll be fun.